want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for supporting this project, as well as for coaching me on the talk and how to talk about this in general. I hope you enjoy it. It's not exactly fun. It's more serious, so bear with me. So, leaning into grief. So starting when I was about 14 years old, my mother began a gifting tradition. She would impose upon me a collection of small animal figurines about this big. So you'll have something to remember me by, she would say, rather darkly. The gestures were sort of lighthearted, but also pointed to her deep discomfort with her legacy. These morbid gifts stood less for her role in my life and more for her anxieties about her mortality, about remembrance, about being a good enough mother. But her fears didn't paralyze her. She somehow knew she'd die before she was 65 and lived pretty intensely as a result. She was a surgeon, that's her, a professor, a researcher, an entrepreneur, a blogger, a tennis player, and mentor to many, including me. I'm a medical student as well. In September, this past September, fit and healthy, and with a lot to offer left, she mysteriously fell down some stairs, and it resulted in a major head trauma. After 6 months in the hospital, her coma was upgraded to a persistent vegetative state. She would never wake up. A strong body was now divorced from its once formidable mind. She ultimately passed on in February, but she was really gone the moment she fell. I then began to move through life differently, and I wanted to capture it. I knew that the early experiences that I was having with this acute loss would change. They would evolve, deepen, or maybe even go away entirely. I really didn't know. Like when I would reach to call her about an article I read or a lecture I just attended, taking a beat to remember that she doesn't exist. The world implodes for just a moment. I also wanted to track how I felt. Perhaps it was because I desperately hoped that it would change, that I could watch myself crawl out of the despair and anxiety. But I also wanted to concretize her legacy in my life. Along with those wincing moments where her absence was really acutely felt, I wanted to watch those crushing moments soften, maybe into something more fond. So what did I do? So I started just journaling. I kept a journal with 750 words, and I tried to use its metadata function to track things like anxiety or mood or location or memories. And it was helpful, but it required setting aside a time of day, and it didn't help me catch ephemera that I encountered in the daily natural flow of my life. I also dabbled with some mood tracking, but they didn't quite fit. Mood tracking assumes, or seems to assume, at least most of it, that you want to track away the sadness, that you want to optimize being happy all the time. But grief isn't pathological. It's not bad to be sad. It's just hard. Instead, I just decided to make my own tool. An app, my own Google form, really. So I created a link on my home screen of my iPhone to a custom Google form where I decided to dedicate that, where I logged my own experiences on my own terms, because I could customize it. Mobilizing my project enabled me to track these experiences as I met them in my daily life. I called it leaning into grief because instead of compartmentalizing it, I was moving through the experience of loss, embracing it, and giving it space in my daily life. Right now, the forum has 4 main questions. The first is what I call just mom sightings. So I sort of tag what kind of sighting it was. Was it a sight, a sound, a smell, a memory, topic? Second, I have a comments box. And originally I thought that I would just use this to put a few keywords like new bicycle or grant writing. But it turns out that this box ended up being an invitation to pause, to reflect, and to write a little bit more for a few sentences. Not only have I been marking the most immediate impression of the moment, but I find myself exploring it further, going deeper, uncovering more of the past that seem hidden in that moment. Third, I mark the location, really basic. And lastly, I choose an affect. So I structured the form so that I could choose more than one at the same time. So in grief, and probably in life in general, you can experience multiple and seemingly incongruent emotions at the same time. So creating my own form allowed me to name my moods myself, like warmed, which you don't actually see on here, but it's down the list, which is like feeling fondly grateful or something like that. Finally, while I can't put photos into Google, I decided to use Flickr to capture some images that I saw along the way. The idea was to both visually and viscerally capture the effects things, people, places had on eliciting my mother and her memory in my daily life. So since I started tracking about 5 months ago, I have about 118 unique entries. And I'm not completely efficient. I probably log about 50 to 60% of what I would consider a mom encounter. Some days I have multiple entries, some days I have none. And I've played around with preliminarily color coding the types of sightings I've had on the left, or the kinds of affects that I've seen, so I can visualize the data better. By type, so I talk about her a lot. I remember her a lot too. And I see her, the visual sightings, pretty often. Not surprisingly, I'm sad a lot as well, mixed with a lot of nostalgia, sometimes anxiety. But I also do encounter some feelings of warmth and happiness as well. Have I learned anything? Well, I'm not entirely sure. I know I've experienced life and loss a bit differently as a result. I know that I've given myself the time and the space to hold on to a fleeting memory, a biting one even, explore it, cherish it, and then place it away in my growing archive. And there has been definitely something therapeutic in that act. The kinds of things I've logged have been as silly as a Q-tip, giving flashbacks to a clinic, she was an ENT surgeon, or as serious as a holiday. And I'm sure if I had my brother and my sister track do the same thing, they would have created the picture of an entirely different mom. My hope is to track her in relation to me, or perhaps it's me in relation to her. That is, a self that's porous to others and vulnerable to the way that others impress themselves in our lives. Following her funeral, I went to my childhood bedroom, and I stared at my hair-end collection. And I wish I hadn't resented these gifts and cherished them more, cataloging them and putting them into an archive. But perhaps they have more meaning as a fuzzy aggregate, standing for something she desired, remembered, cherished. But really, her legacy, as I've learned through tracking, is really in my daily life, when she catches me off guard, popping in and out of my days with little clues. So I'm in the middle of this lives logging project, and I want to go for at least a year. Definite trends are hard to determine, but so far it seems that each writing and logging is a reading and a rereading itself of her and her memory, enabling a moment of interpersonal and intergenerational exchange that I think maybe is far more meaningful than the memorabilia on my shelf or in my spreadsheet.
Is it on? Okay. So we have about 7 minutes to have Q&A, so you can start thinking about what you'd like to ask Dana, but I'm going to start us off. And I'm wondering, I know you said that you felt like it was cathartic, something like that, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the emotional impact of having done this tracking experiment on, I guess, on the experience of grieving the loss of your mother.
Well, I'm not. I wondered sometimes if, like something in my daily life would happen, like I was in a work situation, for example, and something would remind me of her, and I have this tracking thing. And instead of being able to maybe focus on the task at hand or the conversation at hand, it would take me to another place. And that could, I think in some ways that's a good thing. That's kind of the point, is that it allows you to sort of dwell in these sad flashes that come through your mind. But also that could be distracting. So I think, I don't know how to answer it, because I think in some ways it enhances the emotional experience, but I think that's also a good thing. I think if you don't explore or experience or invite the effects of trauma into your life and you just sort of suppress them, it's going to come back to bite you. Another way you might somatize it. So I think, I don't know, I think it made it more present in some ways if I decided to track it. Sometimes I would let it just go and do it at the end of the day and then sit with that at the end of the day. But I think it fleshed it out more.
I was guessing that it sounds like what you're saying, that in a way it was a process that made it more explicit to, which kind of is your title, I guess, into grief. You actually are explicitly experiencing it and therefore maybe going into it more than you might have otherwise, which is cool. So who else has a question for Dana about this experiment? Come on up, if you don't mind. I'm slow.
Hi, Dana. I'm Mike. Thanks so much for sharing this with us. I think it's really neat the way you've structured this and the way you're using it to help yourself through it. I'm kind of curious about the more technical implementation side of it. So when you have like that app and it has to load, do you find yourself like, it's interesting to me like there's that time delay, and I'm curious like how that affects your use of the app that you made, and like, do you wind up like changing how you feel in like those 30 seconds or a minute, or I'm just curious like how the tool affects your mood.
Yeah, so I don't know if this was clear, but when I say I made my own tool, I'm not a technical engineer. I made a Google form, and it's actually super quick when you just click the link on your home screen to what takes you to a website. If anything, that act of taking out your phone, clicking the thing, prevented me from tracking every little thing, because I wouldn't want to interrupt my life all the time. I think the act of tracking did affect how I was feeling and my mood, because the initial encounter, for example, might have elicited a really surface level response like surprise or something that was kind of happy. And then by logging in and tracking, in that comments box, I might end up writing 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 sentences where I'd then go specifically into it, and I actually might get kind of depressed because I started thinking more about, oh, remember that time when we did that, and it would get me take me down a little memory rabbit hole. So then, yeah, my mood would change in the middle, but that was kind of the beauty of being able to click off a million different kinds of moods, because I could recognize the sort of initial stuff, the superficial stuff, as well as the deeper stuff. But I think if anything, it was the need to have to take out the phone and just open it up and click an app, not necessarily the loading of the app itself.
To follow up on that, I wondered about contrasting it to those memories, sightings, whatever, where you didn't log anything on, because you said sometimes you put it in the app and other times. And I wonder if, I'm not sure you can do this, but if looking back, the apps you don't log are, I could imagine that they fade quicker or are less real, or I could imagine you experience them more because you're not distracted by that. I don't know if you've thought about how logging or not impacts sort of your experience.
Yeah, I have thought about that. I usually, I make choices about what I do log if it's interrupting what I'm doing. Like if I'm having a conversation with someone, I'll try to make a mental note about the citing or whatever. I mean, sometimes it's something that just comes up in the topic of conversation, and my brain will go sort of laterally, and I'll just try to make a note to later that night to do it. But I think I'm not exactly. I feel like I'm not answering your question very well, but it did affect. I think it does affect how I experience it, and I'm not. And I think the things that I didn't log, I don't know what happens to those things, but at least the things that I do log, I have gone back into the spreadsheet, and I'm surprised. I'm like, oh yeah, that happened. So I think those are things that I could say with some confidence that they would have disappeared, because they actually did disappear from my memory, and only now by going into the spreadsheet I could see it. And I'm not sure how important it is looking back in the spreadsheet. I haven't done much of that. The charts that you saw were just really quick, like, oh, let's see what this would look like. What's the breakdown of the affect? What's the breakdown of the the sightings? But I don't know yet what I get out of looking at any of that, really. I could say most of the benefit so far has been just doing it. And there's something nice about seeing it, too, the results.
All right, I think that's all the time we have, but I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's actually an extremely beautiful experiment and quite different from a lot of the tracking experiments that we generally see. So thanks for sharing that with us, Dana. Thank you.